Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into the origins and evolution of American government. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also the host of this discussion. And here he is, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Agnes, and welcome to a Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Tuesday, the 14th day of March in the year 2017, and I guess we could say that we caught a break in terms of the storm, but it looks like most of the East Coast caught a break. Obviously, there's serious snow and wind and sleet and things, but the 2-foot snowfall that was being predicted right along the coast of the major cities, it looks like that's not going to materialize. It appears that the storm coming up the coast was actually a little bit closer to the coast than they thought. So the brunt of the storm, which they thought would be right along the coast, is a bit inland. So it looks like upper New York State, the area, Syracuse in that area, is going to get nailed. But the major cities, of course, I guess Syracuse is a major city, but the Albanys and the Syracuses and stuff are going to probably get the bulk of the heaviest snow. But here we have it. It's the roads are still clear, so we did catch a break here in Appalachia. It is a pleasure to be with you on this our second day of broadcasting this week, live broadcasting that is, and again I've talked to a number of folks. And again, the fact that yesterday was our first program in the 4th year that we've been on the air with the Virtual Center is kind of exciting. The more I hear that, it's a little bit difficult to believe for me. But here we are. This is our second day of our 4th year, as it were, and we're live once again. So welcome. I do appreciate your continued support of this program, and more importantly, of the Head On Radio Network. I think, given some of the things that are happening, both nationally and regionally, I think it's becoming very clear that alternative perspectives and an alternative voice, like that reflected and represented in the Head On Radio Network, is more critical than ever. I think it's ever. The last thing I think we can afford to do is allow ourselves to all start marching to the same drumbeat and to stop asking questions and stop asking the difficult questions. And I think that's what the Head On Radio Network is about. That I do believe is about what progressive thinking is about. And I do thank you for your continued support of the Horn, of Bob Kincaid and Agnes and those folks. And I thank you. And again, I thanks for the opportunity to be here into our 4th year with the Virtual Center. We'd love to hear from you. We do have a phone number that is available. Agnes is in the studio, and if you call, Agnes will answer the phone. We'll get you on the air immediately. The phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to share your thoughts with me one-on-one in an email, I would be honored to hear from you. And I promise you that I will acknowledge receipt of your email and that I will do the very best I can to share your thoughts, your concerns, ideas, hopes, whatever they might be. As expressed in the email, I'll do the very best I can to represent your interests in this. But again, you can take care of it yourself by just calling the phone number and coming on the air yourself. But again, if you would trust me to do it, I'd be honored to do that. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. And again, I do call your attention to our Facebook page. I do try to take every opportunity that I can to share with you some of the links on what I think are some of the most insightful articles that I run across in my reading as I prepare for these programs. And if there's something there that I think you would be well to take your time to look at, just in case you might forget it, I usually do try to put the link on a Facebook page along with some commentary, because I do believe that I have an obligation to tell you what there is about that particular piece that I think is worth your time. And by reading what I've written, you can get a pretty good idea as to whether you want to take the time and just click on the link, and it's there. And I've become pretty regular with our Facebook page. I usually don't let more than 2 or 3 days go by without posting something on it, because very honestly, I do feel a sense of obligation to some of the people who have been following this page and this program since its inception. And I really do appreciate the opportunity to share these thoughts and these ideas with you. It keeps me going, keeps me alive, keeps me sharp, I hope. And I hope, again, I hope that each of these programs that we do on the Virtual Center is one that you can always say, well, I may not have agreed with everything he said or what he said, but on the other hand, I appreciate the ideas. It's a new way of looking at things, a different way of looking at things. And it's good that I know that particular perspective is out there. So that's really what we hope to accomplish here at the Virtual Center. Let me get into today's program by sharing just a couple of off-the-top thoughts with you. I want to return to the Stephen K. Bannon model, if you will, that we began to touch on at the end of yesterday's program. I'd like to take probably the better part of today's program and address that, because I really do think it's quite significant. And I hope that if you bear with us, I think you will agree with me that there's some interesting commentary associated with it. I think it's an important issue. I think it's something that all of us would be well advised to pay particular attention to. As many of you know, the reason we do begin 1/2 hour later on Tuesdays here at the Virtual Center is because I am a member of the local Rotary Club here. I've been president of that group on 2 different occasions in the last the first time was in 1999-2000, and then again in the year 2013-2014. So I have maintained my membership in the club, and of course the meetings go from 12 to 1 on Tuesdays. So that means that in order to get home and do the program, we've had to start the Tuesday programs 30 minutes later than we do our Monday and Wednesday programs. And for the most part, we are very, very fortunate that we have a program committee and the chair of that committee who does a wonderful job coming up with really creative, insightful programs. Today's was no exception, and I was chatting with Agnes before we came on the air about this program today, and I found it particularly encouraging, to the point that I wanted to share it with you. Because, very honestly, we're talking about the economy here in West Virginia. And the fact of the matter is, there's not all that much to be encouraged about. We are looking at a $500 million budget deficit for this year. The legislature just yesterday released its budget, and now we've got just a little bit less than a month left in the session for the governor's office and the leaders of the legislature to do battle over the various budget and see if there's a place or a way that they can come to some sort of meeting of the minds about this budget. It's an incredible burden when you think of trying to fill or make up for a $500 million budget deficit, especially in a state that has gone down so far as West Virginia's economy has. And of course, it's usually associated with coal. We know that. But the fact of the matter is, what makes the demise of the coal industry so painful here in West Virginia is that for so long, the state avoided, I don't think it just neglected low like the demise of the coal market. By putting all of West Virginia, we created a situation which made us totally dependent on the viability of coal. And if anything happened to the coal market, our economy was going to be in trouble. And indeed, that is exactly what has happened. In recent weeks, maybe the last month and a half, it appears that the coal market has come back a little bit. But I think realists are aware that there's no way in the world that the West Virginia economy is ever going to come back relying exclusively on coal to the point where it was some 30 and 40 years ago. Those days are gone. And the fact of the matter is, of 30 years here in West Virginia, jobs have been disappearing in the coal industry rapidly. Technology over the last 25, 30 years has displaced any number of deep miners. And so while West Virginia continued to market amounts of coal, tonnage of coal, the transition, coal, technology rather than power, and the number of good jobs was declining in this. But over the last 10 years or so, well, maybe not quite 10, say the last 5 to 7 years, West Virginia Coal has undertaken a very successful advertising campaign, has created a PR organization that's called here Friends of Coal. And the implication is that the industry and the mining and the miners, the laborers, are on the same page. And what has happened basically is that over the 2 terms of Barack Obama's presidency, the Friends of Coal have directed responsibility for the demise of jobs in West Virginia to what has been labeled Obama's war on coal. The fact the war on coal began a lot earlier than Barack Obama's ascendancy to the White House. But again, the industry has been very successful in shifting the burden of responsibility from itself to Washington. And of course, as part of the result of that politically, of course, is that the state has become a solid red state politically, as the entire upper echelon of West Virginia government is now controlled, with the exception of the governorship, by Republicans. And of course, the reality is that the current governor, who is a Democrat, just became a Democrat a short while ago. For a long time, he was a Republican. So basically, we've seen a political shift here that has reflected the economic realities of the day. The presentation at the Rotary program today was delivered by the governor's new director of state commerce and development, the development office, an engineer who has had an engineering company here in West Virginia for a number of years. His name is Jim Thrasher. And Mr. Thrasher was talking about his years of work with Jim Justice at the Greenbrier, about his long relationship with the governor before he became governor, and his admiration for the commitment to the state that prompted Jim Justice to even run for governor. He made the comment that when Jim Justice told him that he was contemplating running for governor, Thrasher's immediate response is, "Why in the world would you do that?" And Justice's response is, "Because I love the state and I think I can make a significant contribution to helping it to turn its economy around." Well, there's no question, and throughout the political campaign, Justice emphasized the fact that here in West Virginia, we tended to seem to be 50th in everything. No matter what the barometer was or what the issue was, West Virginia was always last or second to last. And the concern that he has raised, and I think it's an appropriate one, is that over the years, West Virginians have adjusted to being 50th in everything. They have accommodated that reality. And so part of turning the state around is turning the psychology of the state around, turning that attitude around. And from Thrasher's comments, it's very clear that he admired Jim Justice for taking this responsibility on. And that's why he agreed to take the job when Justice offered it to him as well. Both of them, it seems, believe that they have something material and meaningful to offer to the state in its effort to turn the economy around. It was a very, very informative presentation, I thought. And in a state which gets nothing but bad news, it was kind of nice to listen to somebody who said, this is going to be difficult, we're in an awful hole. But the thing you always have to remember is that crisis always exists with opportunity. Whenever you're in crisis, it is also an opportunity if you look at it that way. And so his argument basically is there's something about being 50th which says that you can't get any worse, so now's the time for the rebound. And that's a very infectious perspective. At least I found it so, and I think the other people who were there at the presentation agreed with me. It was very, very well received. But one of the things, and I was sharing this with Agnes in our chit-chat before we came on the air, one of the things that struck me was Thrasher's comment about his own business. And he said, we are a West Virginia company. We began as a West Virginia company. And he said, over the years that I've been in business, which is close to 40 years, he said, I've worked every single county in West Virginia, all 55 of them. And he said, you would be hard put to find anyone who knows this state better than I do. Because as he said, I've worked everywhere. I've driven everywhere. I put 50, 60,000 miles a year on my car because I'm literally driving around looking for business. And he said in the last 10 years or so, we've been very successful. And we've opened offices in the adjoining states of Ohio and Virginia and Kentucky. And then he said something that really struck me. And he said, when we opened our Fredericksburg, Virginia office, and the same thing is true for our Lexington, Virginia office, it became very clear to me that when I visit those offices, I can't really talk a lot about the fact that our business is based in West Virginia, that we are a West Virginia company. Because to be very honest with you, West Virginia is viewed outside the state as technically inept. And if we want our business to be greeted with respect, then we have to basically downplay the fact that we are a West Virginia business, because people outside West Virginia don't believe that West Virginians are competent. That's the product of being 50th in everything for so long. That's the challenge of turning this whole economic thing around. That particular story really struck me. The other thing that struck me, and I actually found it a little bit exhilarating and a little bit exciting, was his sharing with us of the governor's strategy, the governor's plan for turning West Virginia around. And it involves debt. It involves the reality that there's a lot of cheap money out there that is available. interest rates remain low. The Fed obviously is raising them. In fact, the anticipation is in the next day or two, the Fed is going to announce another increase in the interest rate, which will be the third in the last year. But despite that, interest rates remain very low. Money is cheap. And apparently, according to what this fellow suggested, the governor's strategy is to borrow heavily and invest heavily in West Virginia's infrastructure, knowing that in the long term, the economy can only come back when the infrastructure is updated and solid. The reality is that the jobs that will be created by this initiative in infrastructure is going to generate short-term income for the state. It's going to make it possible to pay back the bonds, the interest on the bonds. But the reality is this is only short-term. When the infrastructure is rebuilt, it'll be there for future use, for future generations. But by that time, we've got to have the economic capability of taking advantage of that. Because these infrastructure jobs are not long-term, they're short-term. What we have to do is fill that gap. And as he said today, it's a high-risk operation. But everybody knows that if the payoff is going to be meaningful, it needs to be the result of a risky venture. But we also need to keep in mind that there is also risk involved. It's kind of an interesting scenario. I found it kind of exciting. It's something that I'm interested in seeing play itself out. I think it's a challenge for all the citizens in this state. But again, people working together to meet a challenge is very, very positive. I think that in the long term, that's going to be good. So all in all, it was only a 30-minute presentation, but all in all, I felt that it was a good presentation. It was thoughtful and insightful. It raised some serious issues, and it had people talking as they were walking out of the hall. People were chatting about some of the things that he said in that presentation. That's encouraging. That's exciting. So I wanted to share that with you because I really believe that we are on the cusp, potentially here, of something new and something exciting in West Virginia. I know that all of you are attuned to the situation with healthcare and the data that was released yesterday by the Congressional Budget Office and the projections that the new Republican plan proposed to replace the Affordable Care Act over the next 10 years is going to result in 24 million people who will not have health care more than the situation would have been had the Affordable Care Act continued. It's a blow to Republicans, no question, that report. Part of the problem for Republicans is that the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, is nonpartisan. In fact, the director, whose name is Keith Hall, was appointed in 2015 by the Republican leadership. So while the CBO and the report are nonpartisan, the reality is if they lean a little bit in one way or the other, it's Republican. It's toward Republican. So consequently, those people pushing this new legislation, this new health care bill, Paul Ryan and the rest of them, have had to do some shuffling to deal with the realities of that report. What they're tending to do, as we can understand, is put the most positive spin on it possible. They're downplaying the number of people who will lose coverage. And what they're emphasizing instead is the CBO's projection that the money saved in healthcare over the same 10-year period will be about $337 billion over the 10 years, which would make a significant dent in the size of the deficit. So that's the emphasis that I think Republicans are trying to play up while they downplay the numbers of people who will lose coverage. In fact, Tom Price, the new cabinet appointee of President Trump, is actually challenging the legitimacy of the numbers. But the fact of the matter is, Paul Ryan gave an interview yesterday in which he talked about what their job is in developing a healthcare program. Their goal is not to make sure that everybody has healthcare. As he defines it, their job is to enhance access to healthcare. But the choice as to whether they get it or don't get it needs to be theirs, not government's. What Paul Ryan is doing, and that's the reason I wanted to mention this today on the air while it's still fresh. What Paul Ryan is revealing here, it seems to me, is a very subtle, but at the same time extremely important difference in philosophy and ideology here. The ideology that drove Obama and the supporters of the Affordable Care Act in that direction was the desire to deliver health care to as many Americans as possible, recognizing that this is the only developed country in the world which doesn't have universal health care of one kind or another. And the ideological difference between that particular perspective and the one shared by Republicans today is revealed in the focus on the word access. Their goal is to make it available to people, but leave it up to people whether in fact they purchase it or not. So naturally, by removing the penalty under the Affordable Care Act for not having health care, then naturally some younger people without serious health problems are going to choose to withdraw, to not have health care. So naturally that's going to contribute to the increase in the number of people without health care. It's going to be voluntary. And Paul Ryan, in the interview yesterday, continues to emphasize our job is not to guarantee health care to all Americans. Rather, to have it and make it available to all Americans at the best price, which they believe can be accomplished only by enhancing competition. as the major control over pricing. This ideological philosophical difference, I would argue, is a key one. It's one that over the years and months here, we've been emphasizing, but much of it has been speculation. And what I mean by that is we've been drawing the ideological differences out because up to this point, those involved in the debate haven't openly taken the kinds of positions which makes the ideologies, competing ideologies, that clear. But now, during this particular debate, much of the ideological realities of this issue are becoming very clear. So the fact of the matter is, from the Republican perspective, the fact that 24 million people, more than under the Affordable Care Act, will not have health care in 10 years is not really an issue to the Republican leadership. It would only be an issue if your major goal was to have everybody covered. Their goal is an ideological one. It's to basically make the changes necessary so that the healthcare industry fits neatly into the ideological perspective of free enterprise capitalism, with price controls based on competition, with the idea of more providers competing with each other for increased numbers of patients. But the reality is that in the healthcare industry, in healthcare insurance, there's no way that you can insure sick people with pre-existing conditions and make money unless what you charge for the insurance is so high, so exorbitant, that it becomes unreasonable. If you insist that all of your people, irrespective of their health condition, whether in fact they have a pre-existing condition or not, if you're going to insist that all your people have access to quality health care, if you're going to move in the direction of considering health care to be not a commodity that is there to be purchased, but as a human right that every citizen in this society has a right to, then it seems to me that you are presenting some very real, clear choices to people. It's becoming very clear what the ideological differences are. The grayness, the blurring, the blending, if you will, the difficulty of separating the two positions is becoming much easier to handle than it ever was before. I think that this is extremely important. And if you haven't been following these debates, I encourage you to do it, because an awful lot of insight and information is being revealed in these debates. I think basically what happens on this particular issue is going to be the determining factor as we move towards the next off-year elections in 2018. If Democrats are going to make a significant rebound, it's going to be because they are able to take advantage of this particular situation, of this particular issue. But in order to do that, they're going to have to become a much clearer, much more definitive, much more willing to say what they think and what they stand for than they have been up until this point. I think it's important to remember that all of the years that Barack Obama was fighting for the Affordable Care Act, he was not getting the kind of support from his own party that one would have expected. That has to change. If the Democrats are going to make a political comeback built around or built on the issue of health care, then they're going to have to adopt much clearer, much more definitive, bold positions than they've ever been willing to do before. Translation, they're going to have to stop being politicians and start taking on the mantle of being true leaders. Leaders who promise, who offer people something definitive. Political leaders who stand for something. So far, those folks have been visible in their absence, I guess is maybe a good way to say it. So this is really an important issue. It's a very revealing one in a lot of different ways. And I did want to make comment on that because I really do think it's significant. I don't want today to end without spending some time on the ideological perspective of one Stephen Bannon. We talked at the end of the program yesterday, and I think everybody is basically saying this, that Bannon is kind of a mysterious Rasputin-like individual in the political world of Donald Trump. He's kind of the shadow behind the throne, as it were. He seems to have the president's ear. He seems to have an inordinate ability to shape his thinking and influence his political priorities. Therefore, it's becoming important to try to understand exactly where he's coming from. My wife made a comment this weekend. It made reference to a comment that Bannon had made some time ago about Lenin. And the fact that he saw himself in a way, the same way that Lenin saw himself. That his mission, his job, was to blow things up. Was to basically initiate meaningful, substantial change. To be, in effect, a bomb thrower over the establishment. It's all tied up with the expression that we hear so much associated with him, deconstructing the administrative state. Breaking down and tearing apart the administrative structure of government as we know it, as we've come to accept it and expect it. And if indeed that's where he is, and if indeed he does have the ear and is able to influence the President of the United States as much as many people believe he is, then I think our time would be well spent to spend as much time as we need to fleshing out and trying to understand the ideological perspective of this guy, of this person. That's where I'd like to go. And we spent some time yesterday looking at the cycles of history. We'll get back to that. But I wanted to share something else with you on this particular issue. You'll remember a couple of weekends ago in Atlanta, the Conservative Political Action Committee convention was held, the CPAC convention. And what made that noteworthy was first that Donald Trump was given a position on the agenda. He had not even been invited to that conference the previous 3 years. This time, now that he's president, he was given a very visible speaking slot. And it was very clear that many conservatives are coming around to supporting the presidency of Donald Trump, even though many of them seriously question Trump's conservative political credentials. The second thing that made the CPAC conference so notable was the public appearance of Stephen Bannon. Beyond his comments in the program he hosted on Breitbart, on Sirius Radio, Bannon has been rather a mystery. He's not been very visible. And there have been more questions raised about what he stands for, where he stands, what makes his clock tick, as it were. More questions than anything else. At the CPAC conference, he and Reince Priebus together came out and did a Q&A, spent about a half hour on stage talking to the assembled conservatives about how they saw government, how they saw the presidency of Donald Trump, how they saw the coming months and years of a Trump presidency, and how they saw their role in this whole political game we call national politics. We learn an awful lot about Stephen K. Bannon from his comments at this CPAC convention. I wanted to share a couple of those with you. If I can, I need to pull my materials together. This is an article that appeared under the byline of Zachary Wolf of CNN. It's dated February 24th. And it is dealing with Bannon's appearance at the CPAC conference with Reince Priebus. Wolf, in fact, refers to the two of them as the yin and the yang that are bringing the White House together and keeping it running, like the fine-tuned machine that President Trump says it is. Looking at the comments at this CPAC conference of Steve Bannon, we learn a lot. He mentioned to the group that there have been a lot of questions raised in the media about what exactly are Donald Trump's goals for the next 4 years. Bannon said at this conference that the goals have been laid out in the campaign speeches that Trump has delivered if people will listen. He said, quote, "This is the main thing that the mainstream media, or the opposition party, as he calls it, never caught. It's that if you want to see the Trump agenda, it's very simple. It's all in the speeches." He went around to those rallies, and the speeches had an enormous amount of content in them. He's laid out an agenda with those speeches, with the promises he made, and our job every day is to just execute on that. He's maniacally focused on carrying out his goals. Unquote. Bannon is saying then that the media is missing an awful lot of the substance in Donald Trump's speeches, primarily because they're focusing on some of the more outlandish things he says about his opponents and about Hillary and all the rest of it. And that's really where the focus of the campaign was being directed, not at the substance of his speeches. Bannon says there are 3 pillars to Donald Trump's governance strategy. This is a quote from Bannon. "I kind of break it up into 3 verticals of 3 buckets," he says. "The first is a kind of national security and sovereignty. And that's your intelligence, the Defense Department, Homeland Security. The second line of work, the second pillar, is what I refer to as economic nationalism. And that is Wilbur Ross at Commerce, Stephen Mnuchin at Treasury, Robert Lighthizer at Trade, Peter Navarro and Stephen Miller. These are the people who are given to rethink how we're going to reconstruct our trade agreements, our trade arrangements around the world. The Trump decision to pull out of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Trump's strategies in foreign policy directed towards China, directed towards Russia, and all the rest of it. All of these seem to, at least from Bannon's perspective, speak to a shift, a change in diplomacy, driven by what Bannon defines as economic nationalism. And the third pillar, the third piece of Trump's governing strategy is what Bannon calls, quote, deconstruction of the administrative state. Economic nationalism is the term that's gotten a lot of attention with Bannon. Trump's emphasis on renegotiating bilateral relationships with other nations, rather than these large multinational trading organizations like NAFTA, like the TPP. Basically, what Bannon is talking about, and of course, as he says, what Trump is talking about in his campaign speeches, is undoing the international agreements that have driven American policy in the more recent decades. The kind of international agreements which has caused the United States to back off on touting its own national interests and instead backing into these partnerships with various other nations based on the assumption that we're all in this together. We all have things to gain by abiding by the same principles and the same rules. So therefore, Our position in the world has to a large degree been governed more by international agreements than it has been by the pursuit of our own national interests. That Bannon and Trump promised to change. That Bannon said at this TPAC conference. That is where the national media, the mainstream media, comes off being referred to as the opposition party. Bannon says all of this is going to be deconstructed. The media is the opposition party, and it's going to get worse, Bannon says. They're corporatists, globalist media that are adamantly opposed to an economic nationalist agenda like Donald Trump has. Here's why it's going to get worse. Because he's going to continue to press his agenda. And as economic conditions get better, as jobs get better, they're going to continue to fight. If you think they're going to give your country back without a fight, you're sadly mistaken. Every day, he says, it's going to be a fight. And that's what I'm proudest about with Donald Trump. Unquote. Bannon is spelling out here the basis of Trump's opposition to the media. It's the idea of a new political order. And this is Bannon speaking again. I've said, he said, that there's a new political order being formed out of this. It's still being formed. But if you look at the wide degree of opinions in this room, whether you're a populist, whether you're a limited government conservative, whether you're libertarian, whether you're an economic nationalist, we have wide and sometimes divergent views. But I think we agree on the central core of what we all believe. That we're a nation with an economy. Not an economy just in some global marketplace, excuse me, with open borders. We are a nation with a culture and a reason for being. And I think that's what unites us. I think that's what's going to unite this movement going forward, unquote. Bannon's definition of economic nationalism has been articulated over and over again in the speeches of Donald Trump. But nobody has been able to pursue exactly what they mean, what these terms mean. I think it's important that we take time to reflect and to dwell on these. I'm a historian, and I tend to look at all of these things from a somewhat historical perspective, which is kind of my training. But let me tell you, historically, what economic nationalism means to me. Do you remember that when we read our history books about the 1920s and the 1930s? And I can remember reading in textbooks about Benito Mussolini in Italy and his brown shirts. I believe it was black shirts, actually. Mussolini was a fascist. He basically believed in strong government. He believed in a strong partnership between government and business. He believed that business would do well if it allowed its decisions, in part at least, to be made by government. In the process, people's liberties, people's freedoms were being sacrificed. I can remember reading textbook statements that said things like, the one thing that you could say about Mussolini is that the trains ran on time. In other words, the most important thing was that everything functioned smoothly. It was fascism. Bannon's calling it economic nationalism. It has no place for serious consideration of anything resembling a Bill of Rights, the idea of human rights. When Bannon and Trump talk about jobs, they're talking about economic opportunities provided for people by government working in tandem with the private sector. Gone is the old idea of progressives that government must serve as the honest broker between working people and the business community. Progressivism is based on the reality that capitalism unregulated is brutal. And if you're going to make it humane, you've got to establish rules of control. You've got to have regulations. You've got to have limits. You've got to have a government whose job is to govern in the public interest, which means giving everybody the opportunity to be successful. In Bannon's way of thinking about jobs, he is basically assuming that all people care about and need to worry about is being able to get a job and provide the economic necessities of life. Things like rights, respect, dignity, morality, ethics, they can't be priorities. It seems to me that's what we're dealing with. When you hear the term economic nationalism, you're talking 1930s fascism. In the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany, in post-World War I Germany, Hitler was able to work with the business community. Hitler's power was in large part supported by the business community, because Hitler and the Nazis promised order. They promised stability. They promised protection. Exactly the kinds of environment that business needs in order to flourish. What businesses' behavior in the 1930s tells us in Germany is that business will support whatever force, whatever power promises it the kind of environment it needs to operate. In America in the 1930s, when FDR came to office in 1932 on a campaign that featured the term the New Deal, if you look at the beginnings, the first weeks and months of Roosevelt's first term, his inclinations, his policies were not that much different from the policies of Herbert Hoover, the Republican president he replaced. Roosevelt's inclinations were to work with business. Roosevelt's inclinations were to go to the business community, go to the banks, make sure that the banks are stable and secure. The first major piece of New Deal legislation in Roosevelt's term was the bank holiday, closing all the banks in the country, assigning investigators to check the banks, their books, their operations, and allow the stable ones to reopen, but not allow the shaky ones to reopen. Roosevelt believed his whole background, his whole training, as was Hoover's, was based on faith in our institutions. If the economy was to recover from the Depression, Roosevelt believed government's only job, only chance of success was to work with business. The first major programs of the New Deal were business-focused programs and policies. But as we know, they didn't work. And as the first Roosevelt term began to move towards the second election of 1936, as it was coming closer and closer the time for Roosevelt to run for re-election, what became very clear to him was that they really hadn't been able to do much of anything to budge the Depression, to improve jobs, to create more jobs. Millions of Americans were still unemployed. It was likely that Roosevelt wouldn't win re-election because he had come into office promising everything, and up to that point, through the first 2.5 years or so, had delivered nothing. Roosevelt believed that business stabbed him in the back. Roosevelt believed that he gave business everything business wanted when he came into office. And instead of using that freedom and using the support of government to expand the economy and create jobs and do the kinds of things necessary to initiate an economic rebound, business took advantage of the situation and made its own bottom lines its priority. Roosevelt felt like he gave business the keys to the kingdom, and they shafted him for it. And in the last year, prior to the election of 1936, Roosevelt shifted gears and began to work in the direction of working people, not their employers. They moved towards things like the Wagner Act, which recognized workers' rights to unionize and organize and strike. Programs like Social Security, so that people could retire with dignity rather than starvation when they could no longer work. Roosevelt, in the second New Deal, the textbooks refer to this as the second, this major shift in emphasis, Roosevelt began to redefine the American dream in a way that wasn't focused on the opportunities for business and entrepreneurship, but rather on the abilities of working people to get an education, move ahead, own a home, low interest guaranteed loans, bank accounts secured, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, many of those things which became part of Roosevelt's legacy reflected a shift in his priorities from society's institutions, its businesses, to its people. I would suggest to you that the legacy of the New Deal through the latter part of the 20th century, with Harry Truman's Fair Deal, Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty, all of these things that took us toward the end of the 20th century, all reflected Roosevelt's progressive view, which was his own rejection of economic nationalism. When he came into office, he tried it. That was his inclination, and he rejected it because it wasn't working. What Stephen K. Bannon and Donald Trump are promising us is a return to that economic nationalism, is a repudiation of the idea that America's principal foreign policy strategy ought to be initiating and educating the world into becoming more like itself. In past programs, we've talked about, excuse me, I dropped the book. In past programs here, we've talked about the economic writings, the foreign policy writings of one Jeremy Surrey. Some of you will remember that when I was in my last years at Concord University, when we had the American History Grant, Jeremy Surrey from the University of Texas was one of our presenters. Jeremy Surrey's book, entitled Liberty's Surest Guardian, is subtitled American Nation Building from the Founders to Obama. Jeremy Surrey argues that the idea of nation building, of creating new nations and investing new nations in order to build them and bring them along to accepting their full role within the trading partnerships of an economically vibrant, developing world. The idea of a global economy, the bridge to the 21st century, Bill Clinton told us in the 90s. America's security in the world was to build international and regional trading partnerships with the idea of eliminating poverty in the world and creating the kind of international free trade arena where all boats would be lifted together. That is the context that Bannon and Trump have set out to change. Their economic idea of nationalism is to engage in bilateral trade relationships through negotiations. Remember, Donald Trump has told us over and over again that he's a businessman. He negotiates deals. He's not comfortable in assuming the presidency of a nation where the rules are being made by somebody else, by representatives of different nations sitting down together and reaching consensus on prices, on international trading partnerships, on the distribution of natural resources, like oil, for example. Trump is not a manager. He's an entrepreneur. He wants to negotiate deals. He wants to win. When he kept telling us that he was going to win so often it would become boring, it would make our heads spin. That's where he comes from. That's what Bannon is speaking to. In order for economic nationalism to be successful, then you have to blow up all of these international trade relationships, which makes that kind of independence impossible. Donald Trump can't be Donald Trump in an economic global world where he can't negotiate, where he can't cut deals. So in order to create that kind of a world, he had to pull out of the TPP. He's got to sabotage NAFTA and many of these other agreements. He's got to basically say, we no longer accept the realities of the one China policy. It may be a good policy, but it's going to be determined by whether it's good for us. And the only way we can know that is to sit down with China one-on-one and renegotiate our trade relationship with China. It could end up that we would support the one China policy as being part of it, but it might also end up that we won't. That's basically the key, I think. I think we have to look at what Bannon refers to as economic nationalism from the perspective of the world in which these people came to power. We elected them to take over the helm and manage the international global relationships currently in place. They came in determined to blow them up and renegotiate deals all over again. Deals that we could win. There's no way in the world, I believe, that people who were voting on November 8th in 2016 could have any idea what they were voting for. Bannon tells us that the proof of the pudding is in the speeches. And if you go back to the speeches, these are the things that Trump has been telling us. What he didn't tell us was that in order to make them all operative, in order to bring them all into effect, it was going to be necessary to eliminate the controls and the agreements that currently existed. All the rules and all the regulations that existed had to be trashed. When the Brits voted to leave the European Union in the Brexit vote, that worked perfectly into Trump's game plan. Marine Le Pen, the candidate for the new president in France, and some of these other nationalist movements within countries like Holland and the Netherlands and those places, all of them reflect this Trumpian desire, if you will, to go back to a time when there weren't any rules, when the people with the power made the rules. It was the 1930s. It was the 1930s when people looked to strong leaders to Superman and Tarzan and Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin and FDR. And we're back there in the person of Donald Trump and the Rasputin behind the throne that comes up with the ideas and the ideologies. The part of this that we haven't dealt with yet is the deconstruction of the administrative state. It's the domestic side of the economic nationalism. There are hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of federal appointments that Donald Trump has yet to make. The media has been struck, we've all been struck, by the fact that Tillerson, Rex Tillerson, is Secretary of State. But the State Department that Tillerson heads is non-functional. All of the previous executives of the State Department have either resigned willingly or been asked to resign. And they haven't been replaced. The bureaucratic organization or administrative structure that Hillary Clinton headed as Secretary of State under Barack Obama is gone. We have embassies that are closed. We don't have ambassadors. And every once in a while, Donald Trump utters a statement like, why do we need all of these jobs, all these positions? We're doing fine. Basically, his whole argument is based on the perspective that you don't need the size of the administrative structure that he inherited. So when Bannon talks about deconstructing the administrative state, he's talking about eliminating people's dependence on these administrative bureaucracies that are a product of a progressive world. If you remember, the whole idea of the administrative state was born 100 years ago in the writing and thinking of Woodrow Wilson. Wilson, in that 1877 paper that he wrote about the science of administration, Wilson's position was that being an administrator is a skill. It's a talent. It's a skill that you can learn, that can be taught. What we had to do, Wilson believed, is staff government with administrative experts in all of these different variety of areas so that the state could serve the electorate, could bring the necessary services and expertise to the kind of problems that citizens would encounter in a modern nation. During the so-called progressive era, that's when government began to tap into our major colleges and universities for talent. Government began to hire economists and psychologists and sociologists and all the rest of it in order to address and bring their expertise to some of the major issues that confronted the modern nation of the 20th century. The problems of urban crime, the problems of urban growth, the problems of transportation, the problems of health, the problems of clean water and sewer, the problems of police protection and security and fire protection, and all the rest of it. These offices, these decisions, Wilson believed, had to be made by people who were trained, who were skilled in making these kinds of decisions. Economic problems needed to be addressed by economists. The problems of a diverse society within our large cities, these cultural neighborhoods, like little Italies and little Polands and little Irelands and all the rest of it. Somehow they had to function together as part of a diverse city. Cities needed managers because the problems of the modern city required the skills of trained managers. This is the administrative state that led us through the 20th century and into the 21st. That's the administrative state that Stephen K. Bannon and Donald Trump are out to destroy. They are committed to deconstructing that state, to eliminating the officers by asking large numbers of people to resign. This past weekend, when the Trump administration requested that all the Justice Department attorneys left from the Obama administration be asked to resign immediately. The assumption was their assumption is you've got to have people performing those jobs who are loyal to you, not to the nation, not to the best interests of citizens, but to you. You got to have your own people. It's your team. The only way it can work together is if we're all part of the same team. Trump's total obsession with leaks, with people within the inner sanctum of the administrative state that are leaking information that the administration doesn't want out there. I think all of us would agree that much of the information that's been leaked is worthy information. It should have been leaked because it's information about things that we in a republic as citizens have a right to know if we're going to behave as well and advisedly as informed citizens. But in the world of Bannon and Trump, there are not anything resembling informed citizens. They are people instead who vote for you in plebiscites. They support you, and they're willing to give you the power and the authority to do whatever you feel needed to be done in order to create the kind of lifestyle and quality of life that they want. It is, in effect, a complete turnaround back to the 1930s, back to the idea of the administrative state, back to the idea of economic nationalism, back to the idea of Mussolini keeping the trains running on time, back to the idea of Adolf Hitler making deals with business. You let me do what I'm going to do, and I'll make sure you're successful in doing what you choose to do. That's the world that we've inherited as a result of the November 8th elections. Tomorrow in our program, I would like to go back to the cycles, to the historical cycles idea of Bannon, because I think that fits perfectly into this. But I think this kind of background on the three pillars that Stephen K. Bannon identified: national security, the wall, the ban on Muslims, the ban on immigrants, economic nationalism, and deconstructing the administrative state. Those are the three pillars in the political establishment, which I believe, and the reason I do that is because I think that's what Stephen Bannon believes, drives the Trump presidency and will continue to drive it. I think all of us need to understand it. We need to understand that defining the media as the opposition is because from this perspective, from the Bannon perspective, the media bringing information to citizens and helping to create an informed citizenry is not what they want. They want an infantile citizenry. They want a citizenry which doesn't think but obeys, goes along. They'll create the jobs. They'll create the kind of economic climate that will let us all the opportunity to work and take care of ourselves. But in return for that, they want our total loyalty. I think we see in the elections that they got a large part of that. So all of these things, it seems to me, the media war and all the rest of it, seem to fit into this puzzle. I think it's incredibly important. We can pursue parts of it tomorrow, but we can't continue it today because our time is up. We're at 59 minutes after the hour. I want to thank you for tuning in on this snowy Tuesday, the 14th day of March in the year 2017. I hope you have a great evening. We'll be back at our regular time tomorrow, 1 p.m. in the East. I hope you have a great evening. I want to thank you for being with us. Please join us tomorrow. Be kind to each other. And again, thank you.